I also want to thank each of my ministers who are here. Thank the deputies and senators who are here celebrating the celebration of freedom. And since one cannot be ungrateful, we must thank the person from the Book Fair Foundation, who with the attempted boycott gave us this celebration. Thank you, Kirchnerists. It seems that you were going to need more than 10 rooms. Jose Hernandez, to receive this. Well, now let's go, because I'm here to present my recent book called Capitalism, Socialism in the Neoclassical Trap.
Y en realidad el subtítulo es De la teoría económica a la acción política.
And, in reality, the subtitle is From Economic Theory to Political Action. Therefore, the book is structured in 3 blocks. The first block is the introduction, in which we present the most emblematic speeches we have given since we have been here in politics.
Que hemos dado desde que estamos aquí en política. En ese sentido, el primero de los artículos que tiene la introducción.
In this sense, the first of the articles that has the introduction is the acceptance speech for the honorary doctorate at ESEADE, which is an article where I go over how my thinking has changed over the years.
Que es un artículo donde básicamente hago un recorrido de cómo fui mutando mi pensamiento a lo largo de los años.
From being what is called a post-Keynesian, a Marxist Keynesian, to proudly becoming a disciple of the Austrian school, a libertarian liberal, anarcho-capitalist.
Liberal, libertario, anarcocapitalista. Después, el segundo artículo básicamente es.
Then, the second article is basically the talk, the Davos speech, the day we told the world. Argentina is present and comes to raise the ideas of freedom like no one else in the world. The third conference that appears in this introduction is a conference I gave at CIPAC in Washington, where I explain the risks involved in embracing neoclassical ideas regarding monopolies and, in light of that, how economic regulation ends up destroying economic growth. It is true that this article could be part of what is part 1, which are technical articles. But given the relevance that this speech had and that it is complemented by the Davos speech, you will find it there. On the other hand, the closing of this section is basically the opening speech of the Legislative Assembly, that is, that famous speech where I went and stood in front of Congress and told them everything that we Argentine citizens wanted to say to their faces, and we told them. I can assure you that I would sing along, but it would violate the independence of the powers.
¿No les parece que ya tengo bastante quilombos? Bien. Che, pará que Mondino me va a pedir horas extras.
Don't you think that I already have enough problems? Good. Hey, why would Mondino ask me for overtime? Well, in what is called Part 1 of the book, there is actually what has to do with the structure of this idea of capitalism, socialism, and democracy. And there you will find 5 articles. There is one where the problem is raised from the perspective of the history of economic thought, and it is where I try to trace the problem within economic theory, which I will explain later. All these problems appear due to neoclassical theory. There is a second article that raises the same problem, but from my field of specialization, which is economic growth. And that article will later be linked when we go to the macroeconomic model part of Part 2. On the other hand, the third article is the article, if you like, where it is mostly concentrated. It is an article that is in English, published in the Palgrave of Austrian Economics, where they called the most important Austrians in the world. It seems that some, who know a lot, forgot it and by mistake, among them. And in that article it will be, it is an article, also, written in honor of Jesús Huerta de Soto.
Y después van a encontrar una aplicación a los impuestos.
And then you will find an application to taxes. And that part closes with an application to the cultural battle and the design of policies, and how to confront and fight head-on against 21st century socialism. And the strategy that they were building based on Gramsci with the logic of the group that was called the Sao Paulo Forum, and now the Puebla Group. That is, those enemies who, suddenly, try to overthrow this government because they want socialism and misery to continue. Regarding Part 2, what is presented there is a model of intertemporal macroeconomics, which serves to understand how I see these problems. Where, in addition, what you will find is that all modern macroeconomics is written in terms of economic growth. Basically, from my point of view, at the intermediate level, because at the advanced level the best book is that of Dr. Federico Sturzenegger, who is here present. There is a book by Barrow called Macroeconomics, and it works with the idea of the Solow model. In that sense, I replicated the type of exercise, then I raised the problems that he, Solow, has and the first patch appears, for a problem called dynamic efficiency. Which is the first patch is the Phelps rule, but it is only a problem. That model is then improved and put into mathematical terms, specifically, intertemporal, with intertemporal optimization, which is a network, an improvement on the Ramsey model of 1928, which was done in the mid-60s by two economists, one called Cass and another called Koopmans. However, despite that, they could not find a way to explain economic growth. I mean, what's more, when those models were tested in real life, they only explained 15%, and the rest was called residue. I'm going to say that. The model did not explain anything, everything was outside the model. In that sense, a couple of patches were made, and I also explain how to fix it, which is the incorporation of human capital or the incorporation of technological progress, and in that way you can explain economic growth. However, the problem is that all these elements are given exogenously, that is, everything is done by hand and the dynamics are described by hand. Therefore, it is a patch that economists live with. But we have to know that it is a patch. But I am going to tell you something, because in my next book, which I am going to write with Dr. Damien Rydell, who is here, that genius over there, we found the solution, so I am already letting you know that the one who comes after has the solution. And then, what you do is, economic thought evolves towards real cycle models and then exhausts a set of assumptions so that the Solow appears again and is manageable for the general public. But, unlike Barrow's model, which goes down the labor market, in this case we go down the capital market. By going down the capital market, we not only derive the demand for labor, but also, since capital is what companies call assets, on the other side we have debt and equity, that is, the financing of companies. And that allows us to integrate the capital market with the money market. And in that way, everything is integrated, money, capital market and the real side of the economy. It's a pretty funny contribution. And, naturally, this ends with the extension to an open economy. But the core of the book is what is called Part 1, which is precisely what is called capitalism, socialism and the neoclassical trap. So, the first thing you have to think is, well, it's funny because some people tell me, hey, you work 16 hours a day. I say, when do you write? Well, when do you read? Well, I do what I can. But, strictly speaking, this paper or this work, if you like, started 11 years ago. I was basically, it is supposed to be my specialization, economic growth, with and without money. And I came across a problem that we economists regularly encounter when we look at growth problems. Which is called the hockey stick. There is an economist, may he rest in peace, called Angus Maddison. And what he did was estimate the GDP per capita of the different countries of the world throughout history. In general, they could go back to before the year zero of the Christian era. But they do not differ. So, in general, you will find a series from the year zero of the Christian era to the year 2000, and obviously it has updates that. And the interesting thing is that when you look at the GDP per capita during the 1800 years of that series, the GDP per capita is practically constant. The only increase was 40% in the 16th century. That is, after the discovery of America. And that, spread over 1,800 years, meant that the economy grew in per capita terms by 0.02%. In other words, to double the GDP per capita, you needed 3,500 years. The economy moved very slowly, very slowly. The interesting thing is that in the year 1800, there were 800 million human beings living on the planet, that is. We did not reach a billion, and when you look at the year 2000, the population multiplied almost 8 times and the GDP per capita multiplied by 14 times. That is a huge problem in economics. It is called increasing returns. And the first person to see this was Adam Smith with the idea of the pin factory. But increasing returns in economics are often associated with the presence of monopolies, and for neoclassicals monopolies are bad, because monopolies punish well-being. And the question is, if in the year 1800, 95% of the population of the planet Earth was below the extreme poverty line and in the year 2000 that number was less than 10%, with the population having multiplied by 8 times and with living standards that have never been seen in the history of humanity, can you explain to me how it is possible that concentrated structures are bad?
Y de eso se trata esto.
It was obvious that there was a problem there, and that is what this is about. Faced with that problem, I said, then, I have some strange problem with the micro. After almost 25 years of teaching micro, something is wrong. And there I had the good fortune to find an article, the wonderful Murray Newton Rothbard, the father of anarcho-capitalism, which is called Monopoly and Competition. The first thing is that it is an article that you can find in Spanish. And the translation is done by Alberto Benegas Lynch Sr., that is, the father of the hero and Verdi's grandfather. I remember that, after 3 hours of reading that 140-page article, I finished reading it and said, everything I taught about market structure for 25 years is all wrong. And there I became an Austrian anarcho-capitalist, everything. It was a total revelation. Because the problem of monopoly, you have first what Hasley called the difference between the good and the bad economist in the book of economics in one lesson, which is the difference. Is that while the bad economist only looks at a single sector, a single period, the good economist looks at the general equilibrium, that is, he does not only look at one sector, but look at all the other sectors and not only consider the short-term effects but also the long-term effects, that is, the bad economist works with a partial equilibrium model of a single good and a single period to a general intertemporal equilibrium model. So, for example, a certain brand of cars can have a monopoly on that car, but it also competes with the others, and there is substitution. And you can compete with each other. But now I'm going to make it more violent. Let's suppose that we have the case of a company that produces cell phones and competes with 9 others. Then you have 10 companies competing, and now a company appears that manages to make a cell phone with many better features and at a much lower cost, that is, a good of better quality, at a better price. What do you think will happen to the remaining 9? They will go bankrupt. And what's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with it, it's wonderful. If you now have a phone 10 times better, 10 times cheaper, and you have a lot of money left to spend on a lot of other things, come on. Of course. But here we are going to tell something uncomfortable to politicians, and that is that in reality the only monopolies that are bad, which is the true definition of monopoly that was created by Lord Coke, a visionary Lord Coke, and it is the one that Adam Smith uses. That monopoly is when the monarch or the feudal lord gave a company the power to create the only company that sold that product in that place, and that if someone violated that, the state fell on them with all its force. That is to say, the monopoly is bad when the one that is in the middle is the state. Therefore, the problem continues to be the damn state. Therefore, the inspiration started at that moment, and it was then to find where the problem was in the neoclassical instrument. The other element that the article has. Because notice that it is called Capitalism, Socialism and the Neoclassical Trap, that is to say, that the neoclassical system constitutes a trap, and I mention capitalism and socialism. I take that from 2 authors, one is Ludwig von Mises and the other is Friedrich von Hayek.
Si ustedes revisan la obra de Mises, Mises les va a decir con claridad meridiana que no hay.
If you look at Mises' work, Mises will tell you very clearly that there are only 2 systems. On one side you will find free enterprise capitalism, free enterprise capitalism. And on the other side, opposite, you will find real socialism. Now, those are the 2 poles. And the other book that I use as a reference in this is a book that just turned 80 years old, which is The Road to Serfdom. What is the argument of The Road to Serfdom? If I got the number of years wrong, I apologize. I mean, it's more or less the same. In that sense. What Hayek was pointing out was that when a fatally arrogant politician intervened in a market because he believed there was a market failure, the emerging result was that it worked worse. And in this situation, it unleashed more violence and frustration on the part of the politician and led him to have a greater degree of intervention. And so, consequently, individual freedoms were lost as the economic system worked increasingly worse. That is why the road to serfdom, the road to misery, the trap that leads us to misery is socialist do-goodism, because it demands more and more intervention and the economy will function worse. While we have less freedom and the mechanism of coordination and generation of information is blocked. In fact, Milton Friedman had put this in other terms, and with that genius that Milton Friedman had for this type of thing, he says, often, the state's solution to a market failure is a much worse solution. Wow, we have a good example with Argentina. So, If we had to understand this, the first thing we had to understand was what the market was. And this is very interesting, because my experience of interacting with many economists is that when you ask them what the market is, they don't know. I mean, I don't know. It's like a doctor not knowing what a leg is. What do I know? It's strange. So, that led me to explore what the definition of the market is, at least my definition. I understand the market as a process of social cooperation where property rights are voluntarily exchanged. Now, the point is that if there is private property, consequently, there is no state. That makes sense because what does the price system do? The price system is a mechanism for signal transmission, coordination and adjustment. That is, when you make a transaction, a price is recorded. That price becomes a signal that coordinates the agents. Some will be buyers, others will be sellers. They will begin to interact and, to the extent that supply and demand differ, prices are modified until they find equilibrium. Obviously, if the state appears in the middle interfering with private property, that generates noise in the price and, therefore, the market becomes incoordinated. And then, things start to work badly. So, that is also very attractive. So now I was in conflict with friends, because I was in conflict with those from Chicago, who are also liberals, but they are neoclassical liberals. They are liberals. Stop messing around. I mean, let's not get into the purism of the 25th series behind Taylor's development, because if not, the leftists will eat us. If not, we can go back to those who held meetings and that an elevator was too big for them, that the vibe they are putting into the talk is funny, but I am supposed to be talking about economic theory. So, what is happening? You are going to find that the Chicago tradition, well in the neoclassical tradition, the only element for which the state exists is because we are faced with the presence of market failures. Therefore, the only thing that justifies the existence of the state and the collection of taxes is for the state to correct these market failures. But what is happening? That definition did not. With the definition of the market, it did not map to me. And in that sense, my reflection, which obviously will seem a little extreme to someone like everything I do. In that context, one of the things I say is, market failures do not exist. If you think there is a market failure, the first thing I suggest is that you check that there is no state intervention. Because if there is state intervention, the problem is not the market, the problem is not the people, the problem is the politicians. But obviously, if I left the definition there, it was very light. So, to make it a little more reloaded, I said, and if you think, even so, without the state, there is a market failure, go and do the analysis again because it is wrong.
Entonces, para hacerla un poquito más reloaded, dije, y si ustedes creen.
And the interesting thing is that neoclassical analysis and economists, I think that at some point we definitely got sick and lost our bearings. What is a model? A model is a simplified representation of reality. Now, if the model does not map to reality, what does a normal, reasonable mind do? Throw away the model and look for one that maps to reality. Well, the neoclassicals went so crazy that they called it market failure. So, now we have to find out why economists do that. So, in order to find where the origin of all that is, what did I do? I went to Dad, not you, to Adam Smith. You and your business, what do you do? The father of the child is there. The mother too. So, what did I do? I went to Adam Smith. And the most interesting thing is that Adam Smith contained a model of economic growth. The guy, Adam Smith, is to economics what Gauss is to mathematics, someone who was 200 years ahead of his time. Of course, that's why he was also kind of crazy. He didn't pay attention to anyone. I mean, Gauss was a lot more complicated. Here I go, I'm coming, but stop spoiling the titles for me. Basically, there are two main ideas in Adam Smith. One is the idea of the pin factory, which was what he said that if a person dedicated himself to making a single pin, he could produce 20 pins per day, but if that activity was divided into 15 different activities, per capita productivity jumped to 5,000 pins per day. One idea is that the division of labor leads to increasing returns, that is, that the fundamental element that explains economic growth was in Adam Smith, a work published in 1776. But that he had begun to write it in 1766, that is, 10 years earlier. And the other idea, which is one of the most wonderful ideas and that fascinated everyone, is the idea of the invisible hand. And it is that each person, guided by his own interest, leads to maximum general well-being. So, we don't need anyone to get in the way. As long as we do what we want to do, it's more than enough. As long as we don't screw up anyone's life. So, as there was always the spoilsport who ruined everything and who considered Adam Smith to be crazy. That is, whoever saw it was called crazy. Then he invented the idea of diminishing marginal returns. It was a fairly simple idea. He said, well, people arrive and what do? They settle in the most productive field, and when more people arrive they go to fields that are less and less productive. And that's how diminishing marginal returns appear. Basically, what Malthus wanted to explain was a truly aberrant thing, which was called the iron law of wages, which said that as per capita income rose, the passion of the sexes led people to have more children and, as they had more children and marginal productivity was decreasing, there was a moment where that found an equilibrium. And if the population expanded beyond that place, then real wages were destroyed and people were starving. And how did Malthus come up with the idea of correcting this? With birth control, the modern versions of which are abortionists. Which, by the way, if you go and read the book of Shemot, that is, the second book of the Pentateuch, that is, Exodus. You will find that already at that time it was a mechanism for massacring populations that the Egyptians were using to liquidate the Jews. And if you want more, here in time, what is inspiring the whole murderous agenda today is the Club of Rome. When the files of this man Nixon are declassified, what is found is that, inspired by all the predictions of the Club of Rome, which said that when we reached the year 2000 there would be no more room for people on the planet and there would be an energy blackout and that would cause the amount of food production to fall. And we would die and be left with 1 billion. So, they suggested promoting the abortion agenda. That is to say, what they think is so advanced with the abortion agenda is an agenda that is more than 3,000 years old, and it is an absolutely murderous agenda for a couple of idiots who made bad calculations. But Mr. Miley is a science denier. So, the analysis continued, the economic analysis. Obviously, among the heirs of Malthus there is David Ricardo, there is John Stuart Mill. And after John Stuart Mill there are two sinister ones like Rothbard and Karl Marx. But, faced with the resounding failure, due to not being able to have a good theory of value, something that the Reds have not yet learned, the subjective theory of value appears and the neoclassical school appears. And there appear three strands, the Austrian school, which comes from Menger.
Pero frente al fracaso estrepitoso por no poder tener una buena teoría del valor, cosa que los rojitos todavía no aprendieron, aparece la teoría subjetiva del
From a
valor
book
y
called
aparece la
Principles
escuela
of Political
neoclásica.
Economy,
Y ahí aparecen
which is from 1871, a line appears that comes from William Stanley Evans and another line that comes from Leon Walra,
que se llama Principio de Economía Política, que es de 1871, aparece una línea que baja de
which is the line of general equilibrium. In that line of general equilibrium, when mathematics begins to be put into economics, a derived effect is that a man called Vilfredo Pareto appears.
Un efecto derivado es que aparece un señor llamado Vilfredo Pareto,
whose ideas influenced a nefarious leftist man called Mussolini, who invented the doctrine of fascism and who openly declares that he hates liberalism, saying that within the state everything.
Inventó la doctrina del fascismo y que declara abiertamente que él odia el liberalismo.
Outside the state nothing and nothing against the state. Hey, how ignorant, what they call us fascists, right? The idea of Pareto optimum said that if you had a situation in which to make someone better off you had to make someone worse off, then you were at an optimum.
Agárratela con Pareto.
If you had a situation where you could make someone better off without screwing up anyone's life, you could make a Pareto improvement.
Che, menos mal que digamos, nos terminaron, digamos, no pudimos ir a la Feria del Libro, sino a la hora no teníamos que ir, así podemos estar todo el día. Vamos a la idea del óptimo de Pareto. La idea del óptimo de Pareto decía que si ustedes tenían una situación,
In other words, there was no optimum. And if you corrected that situation, when those welfare gains ran out, you were at the Pareto optimum.
mejorar a alguien sin joderle la vida a nadie, ustedes podían hacer una mejora paretiana. O sea, no había un óptimo. Y si esa situación ustedes,
In other words, the idea for a stationary economy seemed quite reasonable.
están en el óptimo de Pareto. O sea, la idea, digamos, para una economía estacionaria parecía bastante razonable. Ahora, ¿qué es
Now,
lo que
what
pasa?
happens? As we said, that world that existed from the year 0 to 1800 disappeared with the Industrial Revolution, and the economy began to grow and improvements in the quality of life began to be noticed.
Y una de las cosas que se empezaron a dar cuenta los economistas es que había rendimientos
And one of the
crecientes.
things that economists began to realize is that there were increasing returns, that is, that the world that Malthus had proposed to confront Adam Smith did not make sense.
Economistas, uno Alfred Marshall, el otro Alvin Young, que básicamente
Then,
empezaron a
two
explorar
economists
cómo
appeared,
explicar el
one
crecimiento
Alfred
económico,
Marshall,
es decir,
the other
cómo
Allyn
meter
Young,
adentro de la
who began to
teoría
explore how to explain
económica
economic
el problema de
growth,
los
that is,
rendimientos Y en
how to
paralelo,
introduce the problem of
paralelo,
increasing returns into economic theory. And in parallel, then, economists began to work on microeconomic foundations to generate structures of competition with monopolies.
Ahí aparece el modelo de competencia monopolística de Chamberlin y por otro lado aparece
So, there
la
appears
teoría del
Chamberlin's
monopolio de
model
Joan
of
Robinson.
monopolistic competition, and on the other hand, Joan Robinson's theory of monopoly appears. Now, all this happened back in the 1920s. The Great Depression came. The Great Depression meant a strong setback for the Austrian school, and in the face of this setback suffered by the Austrian school, even though there were other things to explain this problem.
Por más que digamos ya había otra cosa para explicar este problema.
One of the darkest things in the history of humanity appears, along with Marxism. What appears? Who? Keynes. Well, then, that meant breaking down all economic analysis. It meant going back. In fact, it means in some sense, in terms of value theory, going back to the labor theory of value.
Bueno, le están haciendo justicia.
It involved breaking a lot of things. But obviously, as a sinister and inconsistent mechanism, from the 50s onwards it began to fail and started to malfunction. Faced with the situation in which it began to malfunction and where, evidently, that idea of the multiplier was to violate the budget restriction, the economy began and sought to resume the tradition of respecting the budget restriction. And, based on the work that had appeared on the existence of equilibrium at the beginning of the 20th century by an economist, a mathematician, named Abraham Wald, the works of McKenzie, Debreu and Arrow appeared. I am going to tell you a secret. I have already told it once. I am going to tell it again. Look, the model, when I read Debreu's model, a book of Hebrew, it is called Theory of Value. I can assure you that it has a mathematical beauty that is super inspiring. I am going to tell you something. I could almost say that I enjoyed it more than my first Playboy. It is a poetic license. So, what do these models do? They work on the idea of the existence of uniqueness and stability. That is, if the equilibrium exists, if it is unique and if it is stable. That is, if you introduce a perturbation and it moves away from equilibrium, let's see if the model returns. In that sense, what is the point? That up to that point there is no problem, because you need to build a topological construction so that a fixed point theorem can be applied, like Brouwer's or Kakutani's. Depending on whether you work with fusions or correspondences, the problem lies when, without looking at what was behind that mathematics, you want to introduce the idea of optimality. And when you are going to introduce the idea of optimality that was deeply related to the idea of the invisible hand, you start to demand that these functions start to generate maximum values. And that makes it so that if I have demand functions that come from maximizing utility, supply functions that come from maximizing benefits, therefore, if these functions are continuous in a compact, closed, bounded set with these characteristics, if the functions are continuous, the equilibrium exists and is unique. In that case, and also if we assume that the direct effects exceed the cross effects, it is also stable. Now, to achieve the optimality property I need maximization, and for that, Neoclassical economics erroneously demands that these functions be strictly concave, so that it has a maximum and is unique. And that is false, because you could have an increasing function and when you saturate at the limit you would have the maximum. What is more, in that case, in addition, that problem would perhaps imply an empirical problem that has to do with the nature of the fact that there would be only one company left. But in reality, the analysis is poorly designed, and problems arise from this harmful mechanism, because working with constant returns to scale does not allow us to explain economic growth. And when we have non-convexities, we call it market failure, and then we fight against monopolies or we fight against public goods. How many times do politicians tell you, no, because this is a public good and the state must provide it? Look, the best example of public goods that was created was invented by Samuelson, which were the lighthouses. A public good has two characteristics. One is the issue of rivalry. No, a good that has rivalry is if I consume it, no one else can consume it. That is rivalry in consumption. And the other is non-exclusion. If it is given to me, I cannot exclude others. For example, light, I am consuming this light and yet there is no rivalry in consumption. You could all consume it. It is not a problem, and also, the one who is giving me that light is giving it to me. He cannot exclude you, that is, the lighthouse has those characteristics. It is precisely the definition of a pure public good. Then, a lawyer appeared who did not have his head contaminated with all the neoclassical apparatus and went to the meetings that Milton Friedman organized in his house in Chicago. I tell you that poor Ronald Coase was bullied like a novel. Poor Coase, he charged crazy, but the guy was a genius. So, what did he do? So lighthouses, that is, are public goods. So, what did he do? He reviewed all the lighthouses of the 19th century. What do you think he discovered? They were all private. Come on. Other problems that appear are the cases of externalities, which were also resolved by Coase by assigning property rights. Then there are the problems of asymmetric information. And the private sector also has its own solutions to deal with the problems of moral hazard, adverse selection, and creating its own signaling. Or are we not just going overboard with the principle of revelation? And another case is what is called coordination failure. The clearest example is what is called the prisoner's dilemma. But nobody realized that when they make the assumption to have the prisoner's dilemma, the prisoners cannot interact. That is, it is not that the solution cannot be found. The solution is not found because in the middle is who, the damned state that does not let them interact. Therefore, if they lift that assumption, there is no problem of the prisoner's dilemma. Therefore, this whole idea of market failures, because it does not map against our ideal model of Ero de Breu. The only thing it does is favor the intervention of the state, and every time the state intervenes it generates an additional false in the functioning of the market that makes it demand more intervention. And in this way they end up condemning us to the damned socialism, which is what we have to fight against once and for all. Thank you very much.